Okay, in this video, we're going to be looking at the evolution of plants, and we're going to be going through their journey from green algae to what we know plants has today. And so evolution is really just changes that happen to a species over many years. And an easy explanation of species is just a group of similar living things. So the evolution of plants really started when green algae moved from the water to the land. And if you've ever been to a pond or a lake, you've probably seen algae floating on top of the water. And we also see some seaweeds and kelps, and that's all green algae. And what you associate algae with is water. And when you think about the planet at the time, there were no animals on the land, there were no other plants, and algae was thriving in the water. But the next logical step was moving from the water to the land. And so what were some of the advantages of moving to the land? First of all, there is plentiful light for photosynthesis. This is how plants get their nutrients. And if you go deeper and deeper into the water, there's less visible light. And there's also more available carbon dioxide for the plants. There are also some disadvantages, like lack of plentiful water, and this could cause them to dry out, and also a lack of support from the water. So when you're in the water, it's easier to move, you're not holding as much weight, and this is the same for plants. And so now they'd have to support themselves without the help from the water. And also they were used to reproducing in the water, so now they'd have to find a different way to do this on land. So green algae is the common ancestor of all land plants, and a common ancestor just means an ancestor that two or more species have in common. And so after the first step of coming out of the water, what we saw was these plants that have no vascular system and grow very low to the ground. And if I asked you to tell me a plant that grows low to the ground, you'd probably tell me grass, but in reality, moss was actually what came next in the evolution after algae. And so moss had no vascular system, which is a system of how plants transport water and nutrients from their roots and their leaves. And moss is actually a part of a plant group called bryophytes, which is here. And this contains three groups of non-vascular land plants, which include liverworts, hornworts, and mosses. But today we're just going to be focusing on mosses. And so without a vascular system, moss can only grow very low and small because it can't transport the proper nutrients if it's any bigger. And moss also needs to be close to water so that all the cells in its body are receiving water from the environment. Moss also needs to be close to water because the reproductive cells, which are called spores, can only survive and reproduce by swimming in droplets of water. So again, non-vascular plants are generally small. They have no true roots, stems, or leaves. And they absorb everything through their plant body because they don't have that vascular system. They have a leafy appearance, and these are around the Carboniferous period, which is around 360 million years ago. All right, so what were some of the advantages of having a vascular system? Well, first of all, this allowed plants to get off the ground because they could actually transport what they needed. And so the xylem transports water, and it transports water up. And so plants get water from the soil, and that's in their roots, and they need to be able to transport that to their leaves. And then the phloem transports nutrients down, and so they get nutrients from photosynthesis, and so they get that in their leaves, and they need to transport that down to the rest of their plant. And so the first vascular plants were the seedless plants, and these are the ferns. So if you've ever seen a fern and you turn it around, what you're going to see are these little sori, which are basically like pods or clusters carrying all the spores. So here's a little drawing I did here. And so spores are just the plant's reproductive cells that are capable of reproducing without the combination of another cell. And so what happens is the wind comes by, grabbing these spores, and then those spores are then released and spread out, which is technically how ferns reproduce. So now we're going to get into the seeds. So seeds are similar to spores in that they are the plant's unit of reproduction, but the major difference is that seeds are multicellular while spores are unicellular. And seeds contain a developing embryo, which gives the new growing plant nutrients, so it's nutrient packed. So what came next was the gymnosperms. And gymnosperms are basically just naked seeds. That's really what it means. And that they are not protected by an ovary or a fruit. And so these include really any type of cone plants, for example, like a pine cone. So cones contain seeds that give rise to new plants. There's no true stems or roots. And the leaves are the needles, and they have like a waxy coating that protect it from drying out. And so there are two different types of cones. We have the male cones, which contain pollen, and then we have the female cones that have eggs that get fertilized. These were in the late Carboniferous period, which is around 319 million years ago. Hello. And so now So what pollination really is just the transfer of pollen to allow fertilization. And so what will happen is these cones will fall from the tree and land on the ground to form new seeds, so basically forming a new organism. So next, we get into the last seeded plants, which are any type of angiosperms. And these are the flowering plants that contain seeds. And angiosperms are the most successful plants because they use animals to help with pollination and transport seeds. And so this is a mutualistic relationship because both organisms are benefiting from their interaction. And there's also over 250,000 species of angiosperms. So if you go out into nature, these are mostly what you're going to see. And there's also a lot of different uses for angiosperms. For example, food, medicines, clothing, and shelter. And these were around the late Cretaceous period, which is around 125 million years ago. And so angiosperms have really evolved to be one of the most successful plants. And what you might not realize is when you eat a fruit, so for example, you go into your kitchen, you eat an apple, you're actually eating the swollen ovary of the plant, which might sound kind of weird, and they contain the seeds, which are the fertilized eggs. And so again, angiosperms, they all have seeds. They all produce seeds surrounded by a fruit. And not all fruit is edible. So all flowers turn into some sort of fruit, which is just a swollen ovary, but that doesn't mean that they're all edible. And so angiosperms are so far the last step on the journey of plant evolution. All right, thank you for listening.